Chris Sharrett. You work on a book on sacrificial impact, and you have an interest in apocalyptic dystopias, or how can I phrase it? Fantasy.
Well, I guess it comes down to that in some ways, or Fonda Millennium, as Arthur Coker coins it, maybe. But I've been interested for some time in the idea of apocalyptic consciousness as a kind of a formative framework for American consciousness overall. But my reading of postmodern culture right now is concerned with this idea that culture is caught between myth and history. Refuses actually both. There is a distaste for myth as being, risible, as being something that's kind of kitsch and outdated. Yet there's a kind of a panicked attempt to bring back myth, and I use as a model, well, a certain kind of a model, I guess, Joseph Campbell's certain popularity now. I see this kind of nostalgia for myth showing up in the retro mode of postmodern society that people like Frederick Jameson speak of, the kind of nostalgia culture, the anniversary culture, where we have anniversaries for everything from Jack the Ripper to Woodstock to the moon landing to the Kennedy assassination. It's tied up in a certain kind of a nostalgia for myth, for a kind of mythic view of reality. But yet there's a refusal of that. I mean, there's a tendency to send up myth. There's a tendency, for example, in the anniversaries about Kennedy, you see concurrent with the release of the autopsy photos, for example, and this kind of mournful deliberation over the evisceration of Kennedy. You see a different kind of evisceration in the tabloid culture, which is a way of taking the old Freudian notion of the totem system, the idea of a patriarchal society, and really turning it upside down, inside out, but yet not refusing it. There is, I think, if you can say this in a capsulized way, there's a tendency to hold on to the master narratives of myth, the idea of the Oedipal construct, the idea of patriarchy, the idea of the charismatic hero, the idea of charismatic authority, I mean, the things which have really driven the West, which began to come apart, I use as a kind of, if it's possible to really periodize postmodern civilization, I would put it someplace around the Holocaust and around World War II, when the cameras were turned on to the whole business of charismatic authority. Like the cameras, weren't there to capture Alexander and Napoleon, but they were there to capture Hitler and to capture what it means to invest so much into the idea of heteronomy, the idea of abrogating individual will onto some charismatic other. So I think there's a great nostalgia for that culture, the culture of myth, but yet it's finally seen as being outdated. Yet civilization isn't prepared to cross over into history, because history smacks too much of certain kinds of implications, like socialism. Some kind of historical materialist view of reality is really seen also as being contemptible, or something that's really not plausible or acceptable. So there is this really tense dialectic, or it's not really a dialectic in any true sense, but a very tense opposition between myth and history. And if we see this kind of formulation showing up in other situations, like if we refer to certain forms of anthropology, sort of like mainstream early forms of anthropology or mythography, like the works of James Frazer, you can look at Durkheim or any scholar perhaps inside this area, Levi-Strauss. When the will to meaning, when meaning under mythic consciousness is suddenly threatened, what do you do? I mean, to create a consensus, I mean, to create some new sense of meaning, since we don't believe in this thing, like the idea of the father figure, the idea of charismatic authority. What do we do then? Well, according to most studies, and of course you have different methodologies here, but I think a good point of reference right now is the critic and anthropologist René Girard, who speaks about the idea of the institution of meaning when mythic meaning is actually threatened. The attempt is to find a new other, to create a new dichotomy between self and other, to create new forms of tribal warfare. I mean, to really designate a new other and then build a new totemic system and then reinstitute myth. And myth, of course, is threatened by all kinds of processes, which we see happening right now, I think, in terms of the enunciation of myth, the repetition of myth, the kind of washing out of myth. It's too repeated. It's turned into something finally, I'd say, besides myth. It becomes a pure narrative. It becomes a story that's really kind of silly, and it's really set up. So the attempt is to create or to bring back myth through a clear self-other dichotomy that's established through sacrificial violence. I mean, through warfare, through traditional acts of sacrifice, and also through scapegoating. Like, you find some other to designate as a scapegoat, that person is sacrificed. There is a new sense of evil. There's a new consensus then coming from that process. And then you bring back myth gradually. Like, you begin to create a new pantheon of heroes, villains, whatever. If that process itself fails, the sacrificial mechanism that's called scapegoating, which goes back to Fraser and shows up in Freud. I mean, it's sort of a old formulation now, but I think Girard has a new take on it. When that process becomes dysfunctional, when scapegoating can't really operate, when the trials of someone like Ted Bundy or Robert Chambers or the Nussbaum Steinberg trial, there are all kinds of scapegoating functions. So Noriega is a new demon. Soviets were a demon. Now they're no longer quite so problematical, at least for the time being. Or at least like the Soviets are being turned into Americans, in terms of their popular culture now, whatever. But if the scapegoating function doesn't work, you have a situation of what Girard calls sacrificial violence. Sacrificial crisis, rather, where the sacrifice becomes omnidirectional. The individual scapegoating act can't work because the scapegoat is not seen as what the scapegoat should be, which is a kind of aberration, a kind of distinct evil, which once it's expunged can bring back consensus again. To me, the kind of primal scene of this in my lifetime sort of is the Watergate situation when Gerald Ford came on television after Nixon stepped down and said, "Our long national nightmare is over." I mean, the whole language there suggests that this was an aberration, when it was so clearly seen as otherwise. That people intuited, at least, the fact that Watergate was a symptom of a profound crisis within the structure of American politics. And that was also, I think, one more straw to break the camel's back of charismatic authority, the idea of the imperial presidency and all the implications there. But I think the point is that the scapegoating act doesn't work. And that propels a thing which we call now sacrificial America. I mean, it causes us, I think, to look back and see what's happened in this country with the premises of generative violence, the premises which have helped to create meaning, and premises which call for bloodletting. I mean, we're doing a book that deals with how central generative violence is within American culture, depending on people also like Richard Slotkin and people in American studies too. But we're taking that work up to the present day, up to this thing called postmodern civilization, to look at various symptoms of sacrificial crisis, a kind of free-form violence, whether it's a kind of a vague, panicked, anxious schadenfreude, this kind of combined ecstasy and panic over the suffering of others, or whether it's the kind of free-form violence of, say, gang warfare, or the assault rifle culture, the kind of a suicidal, cynical nihilism of people who understand that the will to meaning under myth is over with. It's a culture that's really locked into madness, really, because the fact that it cannot see past myth, it can't see beyond the idea of meaning constructed under myth into something new, some other kind of a possibility.
Is that the only way to retrieve myth, is to sort of have a sacrificial other, or other strategies to retrieve myth?
Well, if you look at the history of myth, going back to the mother lode, like going back to the Greek myths, myth begins with blood. It begins with the eating of the gods and their children. It begins with a kind of a free-form violence, which then coalesces into something formal, and then there's pantheon. There's a classical age, which comes out of chaos. But you really begin with a state of chaos and a state of cannibalism, auto-cannibalism, and then meaning that's constructed after there is a very distinct self-other dichotomy set up. After the whole melee kind of ceases, then there's this narrative of how the world is ordered, and how the benevolent gods step in, and there's that kind of. But yeah, I think blood is absolutely central to any reading of myth, and it's why I kind of resent the work of Joseph Campbell, who sort of downplays the fact that to abrogate the will and to go into this thing called myth as a way of understanding experience. And of course, I think Campbell's language is really obscurantist, and he has all this talk about follow one's bliss, follow your bliss. But he really overlooks the fact that if you have a society that goes all the way in terms of turning history into myth, and I think Nazi Germany is the example of that par excellence of the century, where you have all of these like primordial totemic systems brought back again, and a historical sense of Germany is lost in favor of looking at Germany through Wagnerian narratives, through Parsifal, through the runes, and you have military people with these SS runes on their caps, and also very death-oriented totems in their practice. That's really just a key example of what it means to call up myth fully, because that culture, in order to keep myth in place, had to have a clearly designated other, which had to be wiped out entirely. And what's interesting to me is, and here I'm really referring to a book by Arno Meyer that's called Why Did the Heavens Not Darken, which is like the newest reading of the Holocaust, and I think the points are well taken in the sense that it was precisely when the will to myth began to fully collapse with Operation Barbarossa's failure that the extermination of the Jews had to proceed full force. there's nothing left except to try to keep the population's will to myth in check by blaming it all on this other. And it's precisely at that point, and I think Meyer's argument is really well taken, that the exterminations had to take place. So I think once you go into myth, once myth becomes the key foundational narrative of your civilization, blood is always a factor.
You say the same thing about history, but history is bathed in blood, and there isn't that much difference between myth and history. The same kind of dominant piece emerged here as well.
Well, I think to separate myth fully from history is always a thorny problem. You know, I mean, socialism is a myth too, in a way. I mean, you know, I think there's a certain kind of sacrifice involved in socialism. I mean, the idea that one has to sacrifice, you know, goods to keep the revolution going, for example. But I see the kind of myth that's part of Western civilization based on certain discrete kinds of narratives. I mean, myth can become really a broad, overarching concept within postmodern civilization. Of course, you can look at history as a series of narratives, which I suppose could be read as myths. But I'm taking more of a traditional, I guess, mythographer's point of view about the nature of myth. Myth as things like charismatic authority, totem systems, the sacred, you know, the whole dialectic of the sacred and the profane that's really tied up with myth. But yeah, I mean, I think certainly history today can be seen as myth in the idea that it's open to all points of view. I mean, you take a Derridian view of history, and history just goes. But I think you can also read that as a part of a symptom of anxiety about the disappearance of myth as a sustaining force of history. Don't you think?
Well, it's just case in point, so much of current day popular culture deals with the retrieval of myths and music and detective stories and what have you, the icons, the symbols.
Oh yeah, sure. You've got. I mean, that's part of the retro mode, retro culture, whatever. Bruce Springsteen sort of combining Bob Dylan, Elvis, Motown, and even sort of like quoting lines out of rock criticism. I mean, it's almost like some of Springsteen's music is a kind of paying to a certain kind of scholarly notion of rock music's place in culture, and Prince combines the Beatles and something else. Michael Jackson does something similar, with the Sgt. Pepper allusions. Marilyn Monroe with, Madonna evoking, I mean, there's this tendency to look toward the halcyon days, when things were golden, when there were heroes who could institute meaning, who could create some kind of communal sense. I know when Elvis Presley died, there was a famous quote from Lester Bangs, this really fine rock critic, who said that, he saw Elvis instituting the youth culture, being the founding, primal father of the youth culture almost, and he said that with Elvis's passing, I won't say goodbye to him, but I'll say goodbye to you, which is really, if you want to look at a performer, a creator under the sign of myth, that's it as far as you could take it, I think, and there's a terrible underside to this process, which I call the sparagmos of the new mediascape. The tearing apart of the hero, and they're trying to find palms, or relics, and this is part of the evisceration culture. The Albert Goldman, revisionist books about Elvis, saying that Elvis was not an angel, but Elvis was a monster. Elvis took drugs. Elvis was not the benign prince, after all. The same thing for Kennedy. and also for John Lennon. I mean, and all these figures now are torn to shreds, which is, it doesn't serve the old function of sparagmos, where you take a part of the dead hero's body and you eat it, or you save it, or you put it in your pocket, and then that somehow ties you to the golden age, and gives you this sense of contagious magic. But it's a kind of a sparagmos, the classical Greek notion of the tearing apart of the hero, within the sacrificial crisis of postmodernism. Because what's finally being torn to pieces is not the hero, but it's us. It's the idea that we were silly to ever have faith in these figures. It's not asking us to say, well, after all, they were just, human beings, finally, but it's saying that, we, you and I were crazy to ever believe in Elvis Presley or John Lennon or, but it's still accepting the fact that these people have some kind of heteronomic values, some kind of saintly aspect, some kind of godlike importance, which places them in this mythic pantheon. So the whole tabloid culture and the scandal culture is like the underside of the whole, retro culture, because it just shows, I think, a kind of a general panic and anxiety as myth totally collapses without any pathway outside of that. And I think postmodernism or postmodern culture, as much as the critics are trying to avoid this, is involved in trying to bring back a totalized notion of meaning. It's really wholeheartedly trying to recoup a sense of meaning.
But it's been necrophilia about it.
Yeah, sure, and it's trying to, it's really closing down possibilities, because I believe, and it's not my belief, it's the belief of people who've looked at this in terms of anthropology and mythography, that I think the sacred closes down possibility. I think it doesn't really open up possibility. And people ask me, well, what do you believe in? René Girard says it's important to recover something in which we can believe, but that's a problem. I think that my model is probably someone like Camus, if I had to choose a model, that just kind of keep on, with a certain kind of existential faith, which is a problematical concept by itself. But I think that I'm not bothered by the idea of life being meaningless, in the sense of being without meaning in the traditional notion, of Western meaning, which is really a kind of I'd say, mythic consciousness, meaning.
Chris, you're an American, are you?
Yeah.
You worked with Canadian historical culture. How did that came about?
Well, it's one of those things where people cross paths, and I don't know. The two of us are lapsed Catholics or ex-Catholics or whatever you call that, and not to say that we're immune from that whole discourse entirely, but Arthur and I met about it's been about 5 years ago or so, but we have a set of interests which coincide concerning how we go, pardon me, how one goes about approaching postmodern civilization, and his panic formulations interested me, and we began talking about the whole question of seduction and other issues which he was dealing with, and also apocalypse and the whole idea of Melenic consciousness, which I was dealing with, and so then we began to make this sandwich out of them, and so far it's a felicitous sandwich, and we'll see once the consuming public starts to chew into it, we'll find out how tasty it really is.
You classify yourself as a last Catholic. Now, how important is that in terms of, am I reading something in the...
I don't know. I mean, that's something that a psychiatrist would have to deal with, I guess, but I can't say that I've, totally parted with that whole discourse. And some of it is, I think, quite progressive, depending on what school of thought you take part in. I mean, there's the liberation theology discourse of the 1980s. There's also the moral majority aspect, which is not part of the Catholic tradition, which I was brought up in, but it's still this other side of this thing. Just, I better watch out with that. But I guess being part of that religious tradition as a child made me conscious of the incredible preponderance of Molinic consciousness within American culture, within its perception of art, of politics, of everything. It's not peculiar to Catholicism, but to Christianity. I think to the West. I mean, Judeo-Christian tradition, as it's called. That construct to me is problematical. That there is a tie in there, directly between Judaism and Christianity, but there probably is at least based on certain assumptions about patriarchy and about charismatic authority and whatever. But I think being a product of that culture made me sort of conscious, or I guess hyper conscious of how millennialism is so much part of how we understand history. And my doctoral advisor once said to me that I'm apocalyptic in and of myself. So I don't know, but sure, I think it's probably there someplace or other.
Okay, I just want to shoot up a couple other things. Next, that's your particular approach, and then we talked about the importance of myth and the way we're looking at I don't know, like certain moving of the exhaustion of myth.
Yeah. Well,
what comes after myth? I mean, that's sort of the question I want to mention with and it's all just all for a lot of people.
Well, I think what comes after myth, if we stay with myth as the principal way of understanding reality being a thorny idea anyway, right? I mean, it's and for philosophers, it's a very thorny, issue. But just in sort of generic senses of reality, if we go with myth. With the present circumstances as they are, the next step is apocalypse, and it's apocalypse in the current kind of vulgar sense of that word. I mean, it's not the biblical reading of it really in the sense of revelation, but it's a kind of a self-immolation as the gestures that we carry out to prop up myth become increasingly dysfunctional. And this is my own apocalypticism coming through, I guess, in terms of a social dysfunction. But hell, after all, I mean, in the U.S., the social fabric is rotting. I mean, it's really falling to pieces in terms of the state of our cities, the body politic, the fact that people have really left the public sector. People stopped voting. The symptoms are there. In terms of a general dysfunction of American society. But I can't say there's only one kind of alternative. Mine is to get rid of this old, tired dialectic of the sacred and the profane, of myth versus history, and to cross into some kind of historical consciousness. How that's done, I think, has to be a long, arduous kind of educational task. It's I guess pedagogical function finally, but it depends on civilization finally dispensing with the will to myth, and that's a hard go. It's a real toughie.